A bump in the road, or will Brexit ultimately be deferred or derailed? Theresa May's government appealing a High Court ruling in favour of giving final say on leaving the European Union to Parliament. That decision and a similar appeal from Northern Ireland, which voted for remaining in the EU, both landing in the lap of the Supreme Court. In a parliamentary democracy like Britain's, do referendums, or does Westminster have the final say to carry out the will of the people? On the continent, politicians ranging from former French President Nicolas Sarkozy to Italy's five-star movement are increasingly arguing for what they call direct democracy. We'll ask why and measure the pros and cons. Now, in the case of last June's vote in Britain, the Leave campaign argued it was all about regaining sovereignty. But who then holds power? Who ultimately makes the decisions? Today in the France 24 debate, who gets the final say? With us, Paul Thompson. He's Vice Chair of the British Conservatives here in Paris.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll be joined by Lucy Thomas, former Deputy Director of Stronger in Europe. Also joining us, former UK trade negotiator Tom White. Nice to see you again, Tom.
Hello.
And Barrister Jeremy Smith, co-director of the Prime Economics think tank. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. The United Kingdom's highest court already made time before the end of the year to hear that appeal. It'll come sometime in very early December. This after the ruling that the Prime Minister cannot, on her own, trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty to start the UK's exit negotiations from the European Union. Brian Quinn has more.
Outside the High Court of London, a triumphant statement from Gina Miller, one of several campaigners who sued to stop the British government from exiting the European Union without parliamentary approval.
Every one of us voted for the best country and the best future. This case was about process, not politics. My dedicated team at Mishcon and Council and I are absolutely delighted that we've been able to be part of this debate and to bring some sobriety as we go forwards.
Three of the nation's highest judges ruled against the government, deciding that Prime Minister Theresa May does not have authority to trigger Article 50 of the EU's Lisbon Treaty without a vote by the country's MPs. The government had argued that so-called royal prerogative, a set of historic powers officially belonging to the Queen but in practice frequently used by the executive, gave it authority to exit treaties. Plaintiffs said that since individual rights, such as free movement throughout the EU, were at stake, a vote was required. The government has already said it will appeal the decision to the country's Supreme Court.
The government is disappointed by the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by Act of Parliament. The government is determined to respect the result of the referendum.
The pound rose on news of the court's decision, with many investors expecting that parliamentary action would soften government policies in order to avoid the so-called hard Brexit, in which the UK could lose access to the European single market. Britain's Supreme Court is already scheduled to hear the government's appeal in early December.
Let's begin with what we saw in that report by Brian Quinn. Let's begin with the barrister in our panel there. Jeremy Smith, this term royal prerogative, it sounds very regal. In fact, does it mean executive order?
More or less, yes. It's that part of constitutional power which is left to the government acting on behalf of the Crown, which is, in a sense, excluded from the control of Parliament. So the whole debate about this is whether the rights that are set out in the European treaties should be capable of being brought to an end simply by government's own will, or whether it should have to go through a parliamentary process, which it did when the European Communities Act was introduced in 1972 and when we joined what was then the common market.
So what do you think of that argument? In this case, does royal prerogative apply? Does executive order apply?
Well, essentially, the power to make or unmake treaties is generally deemed to be that of the government through the royal prerogative. However, the court, in my view, quite correctly, has said that, look, the European treaties aren't just an ordinary treaty, but give very specific rights, including the right of citizenship of the European Union, etc. And that and you can't, and all of those rights are given through and under Act of Parliament. So according to the normal norms of parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary democracy, it's for Parliament to decide whether to take away those rights, and not for a government to do that, for an executive part of government to do that on a unilateral basis. I think that's absolutely right. There's a second argument that will come up.
So hold on. So let me get this straight, just so I can understand correctly. So the gray area is that this royal prerogative is so that people who are negotiating stuff don't get bogged down by having to consult Parliament all the time. You're saying this isn't about negotiation. This is about a sovereign choice.
Yes, this isn't about the negotiation process, which of course would not be on a day-to-day basis before Parliament. This is just about who has the right to trigger the notice, because the notice automatically, unless you can withdraw it, which is another absolutely key legal point which hasn't been decided today, unless you can withdraw it, if you can't withdraw that notice, then as night follows day, the notice given by the government in the absence of parliamentary consent takes away loads of rights that people have today. Now, it may or may not be right to take away those rights, but it shouldn't be done by government alone, especially not one that has a mandate for doing so.
Tom White, do you agree with Jeremy Smith, and do you agree that the High Court made a good decision?
I can certainly see the merits of the arguments on the of the case. I was, however, a little bit surprised that the court took it upon itself to make this kind of decision, because in many ways the decision to take away the rights of being EU citizens, and also for British businesses to be deemed as EU businesses, were effectively on the ballot paper on the 23rd of June, and the British people voted to essentially give up those rights. And what we're now entering is a period of practical, very technical and very challenging negotiation where, although we know some of the potential trade-offs at a high level, we don't know all of them. And Theresa May will now be entering those negotiations with a very restrictive, probably, mandate from the UK Parliament. And unfortunately, I think the many MPs will take the opportunity to actually make things more difficult for her, which I know when you're going to Brussels and going through the technical detail, you really want as free a hand as possible. And although we have a history of using European scrutiny committees in the Parliament to check the kinds of agreements you're making in Brussels, at the outset, you go in with a relatively free hand in order to respond to what the other side wants. And we've already seen indications from some MPs that, for example, they want to include in this bill to trigger Article 50 a requirement for a second referendum at the end of the process, which would not go down well at all with the negotiating counterparts, and may actually serve to limit the ambition of what the UK can secure. So, although
okay, so those are the things that could bog it down. But Tom, getting back to the outset of what you said, you're saying that it was the referendum that overrides anything that Parliament can vote upon.
I think the question was very clear in the referendum, and there was a debate around the referendum bill itself, where Parliament assented to putting this question to the public. And I think there is no interpretation of do you want to leave the EU that doesn't entail losing some rights.
But this is complete rubbish at one level, because obviously no one knew what the terms would be, and the question was should the UK leave the EU, and the answer by a small majority is yes. And now that is certainly sets a direction, and Parliament, in my view, would be very unwise to try and go against that. But it's absolutely absurd to conclude from that any old rubbish agreement that's reached at the end of it necessarily follows from the advisory opinion in a parliamentary democracy to accept it, that you have no choice but to accept it. This seems to me to be really, really foolish as an argument.
Let me bring in Paul Thompson on that. Paul, so you heard the last point there by Jeremy Smith. Yes, the people have spoken in that referendum, but Parliament should have a say, especially once the negotiations are over.
Well, I don't want to rubbish any of the points that any of the other participants have made so far, but I think that what we are facing is a situation that both legally and politically is extremely complex for some of the reasons that the other participants have already made. On the legal front, it is true that there is a key element in the case as it was put to the court regarding whether or not the act of triggering Article 50 would be withdrawable or not. The position taken by the government was that once launched, it could not be withdrawn, and that was put to the whole case was put to the court on that basis. And my understanding from just reading a summary of the decision, I haven't had time to read the full text thereof, is that the court attached crucial importance to that point because it meant that once it was launched, that was it, and Parliament would not have any opportunity subsequently to intervene in making a pronouncement on the outcome of the negotiation, because in any event, it would be the whole process would be unstoppable by that point. It's very important, though, to remind the viewers of France 24 that this entire case, of course, and it's already been mentioned, is subject to whatever the Supreme Court will decide apparently next month. And I think that there are different strands in the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court, formerly the House of Lords, one of which is a deference to those exercising political responsibility, and
so they could be much more lenient to the government's
they
case.
could go the other way. Right. I think it's entirely open. I don't think anyone knows, even though the decision of the
High Court's
of the court here was clearly reasoned and sort of very firmly worded.
All right, lots of political.
Paul's hit a really important point on. But I don't think quite correctly got it on the ability or inability legally to withdraw a notification once it's given. This is hugely disputed amongst lawyers, and a former Director General of the EU Council's legal service argued recently in the Financial Times that you could withdraw the notice, as do other authors of Article 50.
Yes.
However, that is in dispute. What happened in this
excuse
case?
me. All I was saying was that the court took that principle as given, rightly or wrongly.
Right,
it was accepted by both parties, but it's still open to the Supreme Court, which may well make a reference to the European Court of Justice to decide that very point. So this could get even more complicated as we go down the line.
Paul Thompson, do you see Theresa May appealing to the European Court of Justice?
Not Theresa.
But the other side might. The other side might. No, I don't think she would do it. If I may, I would like to add a word on the complexities of the situation now emerging, and again, it's all subject to the decision of the Supreme Court next month. I think there are very strong arguments on both sides of this case, quite frankly. I think, though, as a political matter, and this is a non-legal line of reasoning, it is unfortunate that the work of Parliament and of the government, which already was fraught with enormous complexity, dealing with this unprecedented situation, will now be rendered more fraught with difficulty, more subject to political maneuvering, sometimes less noble than other times, and that is not really in the interest of the British people.
And what's clear is that political fault lines are shifting. Opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn was arguably as unconvincing a Remain campaigner as Theresa May. You read his statements, you get the sense that he has since embraced Brexit, but Brexit on left-wing terms.
Parliament has to have a say in this. These are crucial decisions for the future of this country. We're going to be looking at the issue of market access to Europe. We're going to be looking at the future of manufacturing industry, looking at the access of finance services to Europe, and of course, crucially, workplace regulations, environmental regulations and consumer rights.
Tom White, has your position evolved when it comes to Brexit?
I think that although I was not in favour of leaving the EU, I think it brings great benefits to citizens and to businesses. I think once you've had a vote like this, actually what becomes at stake is, does the government listen to the people? And there is, I think, something quite dangerous about Parliament seeking to essentially block a decision that's been taken in a referendum. And it's interesting when you talk about the position of Labour MPs. In some ways, this decision puts them in a very difficult position, because most MPs campaigned for Remain, and yet in some of their constituencies they would have had a 60 or a 70% vote in favour of leaving. And so if they do decide to try to obstruct or delay the beginning of negotiations, or even to attach conditions that mean the Prime Minister can't actually negotiate effectively, they will have to answer for that to their constituents, which will be very difficult for them.
So is this a storm in a teacup?
I think ultimately the government will have to find a way through, but Parliament is not as well organised or as disciplined as it has been under previous administrations. The Conservatives have a very small majority. The Labour leader has only just survived an attempt by the vast majority of his MPs to unseat him. And so we're going to see a fairly disorganised parliamentary response, largely controlled by individuals who are on positions of committees, rather than having political parties pursuing their manifestos. So it's very unpredictable.
Paul Thompson?
I think there are two interesting points that one can make in connection with the position, firstly, of Jeremy Corbyn, and secondly, of Theresa May. Regarding Jeremy Corbyn, in my view, his statement of today could foretend a very savvy move on his part to accomplish a triple goal. One would be to bring himself back into the sort of realm of respectability within British politics by indicating that he's ready to play a constructive role in this whole process. Secondly, wrong foot all of his many opponents in the Labour parliamentary
Labour respects the decision of the British people.
Exactly. He would say, I'm a responsible politician. I have a respect for democracy. And we must respect the result of the vote, which he has said today. And thirdly, many people suspect that he, in fact, was never in support of remaining, although he didn't dare say so. And so the third gain for him would be to actually achieve or work towards achieving a result on the issue itself, namely a Brexit, a break with the European Union, which the hard left has always considered in Britain to be too liberal and anti-worker, and to do so on terms which he would hope would be more, in his view, protective of the rights of working people. So he could make a triple gain in one fell swoop.
Could make a triple gain. We're going to have to take a quick break, Paul Thompson. We'll be back. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.